Just search.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back into the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast. And for our third segment here of the day, we're going to be switching from some stardom cinema advice for the time being and head into some big games at both the NFL and college football with some pretty big fantasy implications. And I feel like this weekend in games in the NFL, I could have picked a number of them. And limiting myself to 4 felt a little bit crazy because this is the week where a lot of things can be said about certain teams. We find out their identities and whether or not they're actual contenders or not. And I had to, kind of parse through some games that were difficult to put on this list, but still make it fresh as to where I'm not dominating this list by putting all the big games this weekend, like Ravens-Steelers, for example, or even a game like Bengals-Chargers, that bizarre matchup for Sunday night. So I tried to balance it with games that, could be appealing and games that I know are marquee matchups and you're going to be sitting in front of the TV for watching them wholeheartedly. But without further ado, let's just jump right into these interesting games this week. And starting off with a game that I really feel could go under the radar just because one of these teams' seasons is practically over. And the other just came off a very heartbreaking loss that could have been one of the best wins by any team in the National Football League this year. And it just makes for a very interesting storyline taking place down in Texas, where the Texans take on the Cowboys. And I feel like this game is one in which you have to understand that even though the Cowboys feel down and out, and the question that I put on the screen seems a little bizarre and a little bit skeptical, I feel like there are ways in which this game can be a bit more fun and exciting in both real life and fantasy. Let's start with the Cowboys side of things. Like I said, I still have some glimmer of optimism for this Cowboys offense. I actually think this Cowboys defense can steadily improve this season. They now bring back Micah Parsons. DeMarcus Lawrence seems healthy at this point in the season. But let's talk about this Cowboys offense because I'm actually a little bit more optimistic about it than other people, perhaps because of this quote-unquote freedom I feel that they can have. Last week, yes, it was a very difficult matchup against the Philadelphia Eagles, and I knew that perhaps it wasn't necessarily going to be pretty. But in this stretch for the Cowboys, I feel like we're going to start to learn about the anxieties this team might have had with the pressure that Dak had on his shoulders and what CD means to this team as well. And how it kind of takes over the culture of a team. Because I feel like there aren't many winnable games left in the schedule. They have a nice little stretch where they take on the Giants, the Bengals, and the Panthers. Maybe they steal 2 of those games. But I feel like the point that I'm trying to make here stems from the tension being lifted in some areas. And so that's why I feel like while Cooper Rush isn't necessarily going to be flashy, he might not be the quote-unquote savior of this team by a long shot, because I do believe this season is over in Dallas. I feel like there are opportunities for this offense and some secondary players to actually get going because they don't have to worry about any links between the organization and what they feel Dak Prescott and CeeDee Lamb should be doing. So that can really help a team. And once you know this season is over and this Cowboys team can look themselves in the mirror, they can turn a page here. Once Dak is healthy, they can start, getting to terms with what this team can become because this disaster of a season is finally over. And Not for nothing, there might be some noise about Micah Parsons' contract, and how he wants to be one of the highest paid defensive players of all time. But at least it's not, two of your most important offensive players who already had so much pressure on them for not delivering over the past couple of years. So that's why I think on the Cowboy side of things, even though Cooper Rush is not an appealing guy, you can still, distribute the ball to more people and get them more involved. So it's a blueprint for what could happen next year when this offense could be clicking a little bit more. The Texans side of things, I feel like, we know what this offense is. It can put up enough points to get you wins, but it's not as impressive as the last seasons where, Jay Stroud looked a little bit more comfortable. This year he seems to be forcing things a little bit more. But I'm really excited to see this defense in action, even though this seems like a matchup they can easily dominate in. I still think that the Cowboys, if they let Cooper Rush just settle in, can win this game in a dominant fashion. No, not necessarily a dominant fashion, but can keep this game close. That's what I'm trying to say here. But I feel like this Texans defense is really what's going to carry in the future. And even though this is not necessarily the best matchups for them, I mean, in terms of seeing if they're for real or not, I think that the game against the Lions proved that it could be their saving grace come playoff time against some very loaded AFC offenses at this point in the season. So look for this to be, kind of a litmus test for the Texans and kind of a blueprint for the Cowboys, if that makes sense. Then the second game I want to talk about, perhaps the surprise game of the weekend, in my opinion. Falcons going up against the Broncos. And I feel like both of these teams are very similar in that one unit seemingly carries them over the other. I think for the Falcons, it's their offense, because when it clicks, it can get going. And they have a lot of young weapons that everyone knows about at this point. And they have a distributor of the football in Kirk Cousins, who, when unpressured, really can put up gaudy numbers that wins you fantasy games and in real life. That's the thing. Pressure gets to him. And so, as a lot of Vikings fans know, and what some Falcons fans are trying to figure out, is that against defenses that can generate pressure, chances are the Falcons are not going to move the ball as often. Whereas the Broncos, the defense, is one of the most surprising units in the league, and they're brilliant at generating pressure. They just had one of the better defensive performances against the Chiefs all year long. So, look for this to be one of those games where it could turn into a shootout, but for both of these units to be brought into light. The Falcons' offense, whether or not it can break down a resilient Broncos defense, and then for the weaker of the two units, the Broncos' offense taking on the Falcons' defense. Can the positives that have developed in Bo Nix's game really stand out? Or can this Falcons defense, who on paper, in the back end, AJ Terrell, Jesse Bates, and Justin Simmons, actually play up to their names? And so that's what I think separates this game from the pack. The fact that we know the solidity of two of the units in this game, but the ambiguity of the other two units excites me. And it should excite you in terms of some already established fantasy stars. Like guys like Drake London, Pitts, Robinson, potentially even Algier, showing up and standing out. The Broncos defense doing their thing, surprising people. But also how unsung heroes can emerge. And this Falcons defense can limit this bizarre Broncos offense. Or can Bo Nix have one of the better games of his career? We're going to have to see, and that's what I love about this game. It could be a shootout, like I say on my screen, but it all comes down to those two weaker units and how they perform. And that's what should excite you. And for the third matchup of the week that I chose, it's the marquee one. We finally get a matchup that kind of makes sense here from a fantasy perspective, but also potentially not as exciting as others. Chiefs, Bills. These are two, like I mentioned in my graphic, championship caliber teams. And this is a rematch that we've seen many times before in both the regular season and postseason. And we know that the Bills dominate in terms of the regular season performances, undefeated in the Patrick Mahomes era in the regular season. And then they falter in the playoffs. But this game is so bizarre, right? The Chiefs are coming in undefeated, but they haven't necessarily played like a prototypical Patrick Mahomes era Chiefs team. Whereas the Bills, I don't necessarily know who this team is, because we know they're capable of dominating teams like the Chiefs, and they've seen it year in, year out in the regular season. But who's to say that they can do this consistently? Because we've always seen the Bills in certain games falter in big moments. This game, a lot of momentum is on the Bills because they feel like the team that's the best opportunity to break the streak for the Chiefs, give them their first loss of the season. So that pressure, plus the fact that I think that the Chiefs, in this matchup already have not played well, that makes me think that these two championship caliber teams might have a snooze fest. I still think, the usual fantasy players like Josh Allen and Kincaid and Cook for the Bills and Kelsey and Mahomes for the Chiefs can stand out. But I feel like that what this game comes down to is which team blinks first. Is it going to be the Bills who get overawed by the moment, or the Chiefs who kind of feel like they wait to kick into second gear? They wait, and perhaps that timidity in terms of waiting till the fourth quarter to really get into that second gear will finally come back to haunt them. So I feel like this game, much like the Falcons-Broncos, but on a much broader level, can be either a shootout, we see two of the AFC's best teams duking it out, or we see a nervous tactical battle where neither team wants to mess up. And so I can't necessarily say this will be the most attractive of fantasy games, but it is one I want to monitor. And really quickly before we head to break, as I kind of got lost in time here, the Packers-Bears game. This could be a bizarre one. Not many people are talking about this divisional match. They're overawed by the Ravens-Steelers, perhaps, and games of that magnitude. But the Packers-Bears, man, can Caleb get back on track is a big question here. Because I really think Caleb is capable of, really showing us what the Bears can be. But against the Packers defense that wants to generate takeaways, and that being one of the Bears' big problems, is holding on to the football, I feel like this game is going to be defined by the carefulness and caution of the Bears' offense, contrasted with the aggressiveness of the Packers' defense. I think a lot of Bears' weapons in this game can have telling performances, whether positive or negative, like DJ Moore especially, and DeAndre Swift, both might add my personal fantasy team. And on the Packers side of things, they feel like they're going to have the advantage on the defense side of the football. On the offense side of the football, they're going to want to stick with their identity. But I do like the Bears' defense as well, so look out for them as a sneaky little grab in terms of a fantasy perspective. But let me know what you think about these games in the comments. I wanted to try and keep it even between, marquee matchups and kind of low-key ones. But right after this short break, we transition from the NFL very briefly to talk about some college games. Which of these CFP potential elimination games do I think can be very intriguing? We want to find out right after this short break.